Hi, we'd like to welcome you to another in a series of webinars designed for departments of transportation. And I'm Terry Bills. I'm the Transportation Industry Manager here at Esri, and today we have a great honor. We're joined by Alan Ibaugh, who's the president of DTS, and Alan Kidner, who's the GIS manager at Ohio DOT. And today's webinar is focused on best management practice in GIS for state DOTs. And as we move to a greater emphasis on data-driven decision-making processes in DOTs here in the US and the requirements for transportation asset management plans, the role of information becomes all the more critical. And an integral part of that information infrastructure is GIS. And so today's webinar is focused on what GIS managers can do to ensure that GIS becomes that integral part of every DOT's information architecture. What is the role of effective data governance? How do GIS and IT need to work together to create an effective system of data management and data access? These and other questions are the topic for today's webinar. So before we begin, I'd like to point out that we are recording this webinar, and while everyone will be on mute, there will be time for question and answers at the end of the presentation. You can type your questions into the question box, and we'll try to answer as many as time allows. And additionally, the slides that you do see as part of today's webinar will be available to you on the GeoNet group, Departments of Transportation, and we'll give you that link and others at the end of the presentation. So really, without any more ado, let me turn it over to Alan and to Ian and to kick off today's webinar. So.
Okay, great. Thanks, Terry. So this is Ian Kidner. I'm with the Ohio Department of Transportation, and I'll be starting us off. Thanks again, Terry, for hosting this and giving us the opportunity to chat with the community here. These are always great opportunities to start conversations and then later hear what's happening and what's working for people and what's not working for people. It's always a great learning opportunity. So today, as Terry said, we're going to talk about best management practices in GIS and kind of from the DOT perspective, but I'm sure these could apply to any number of areas as well outside the DOT industry. And when I start thinking about best management practices for managing things, before jumping into stuff, I always try to think, well, what problems am I trying to solve? What things am I trying to do? And so to frame that conversation for people who maybe aren't as familiar with what the DOT agencies are looking at, this slide kind of shows what the challenge is, or part of the challenge. This is put together by a group of engineers that does a large assessment of the nationwide infrastructure. And as you can see, we could be doing better as a nation. And basically, we built a lot of infrastructure in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and a lot of that is coming to the end of life kind of all at the same time. And we need more effective ways to look at that replacement and enhancement of that infrastructure. On top of that, we have a funding challenge. While this slide, the timeline only goes up to 2013, I think the trend continues where effectively the gas tax rate, which is the primary funding of transportation infrastructure activities across the United States, that has not really increased substantially or very much at all. And when you start accounting for inflation, we've effectively experienced a decrease in funding dollars of what we can put back into the transportation infrastructure. I do know that since this slide or this graph was put together, some states have successfully increased the state gasoline taxes, because there's two. There's a federal and a state often. And so some states have been able to shore that up some, but I think overall that the challenge remains the same across the agencies. And then you also have this, which is becoming more and more of a topic. Not to say that in the past we haven't had multi-generational workforces, but I think that when we start looking at the speed of technology, the speed of business these days compared to previous times, being able to look at our workforces in different ways is becoming more significant. I don't think that we're going to see as many people sticking it out at an agency for 30 years and retiring like we have in the past. And when you start having people coming in and out of an agency, that means that from a management perspective, you need to take a different approach to how you're retaining institutional knowledge, how you're operating, so that you can maintain some continuity. And I hope that some of the stuff that we'll talk about in today's presentation will give some insight of how to set up things to provide that continuity. One thing that lots of agencies are doing to help solve some of these problems is the notion of transportation asset management, or TAM. And agencies were doing this for a long time already, but when the MAP 21 legislation came around a few years ago, it formally said, hey, DOTs, you need to have a documented plan for how you're going to do asset management. And these are some of the ones from ODOT's asset management plan that are probably very common to most DOTs, where policy-driven, performance-based, you need to figure out what options work and what don't work. And then, of course, it needs to be data-driven. We think that to create that efficiency for those cost savings, we need to understand that what we're doing actually makes a difference as opposed to just the best guess. And of course, to make data-driven decisions, we need a lot of information. And I think that's where the tie-in with GIS becomes more and more significant across the agencies and the roles. I included a link here to a video that unfortunately we're not going to be able to play for some technical reasons, but check it out if you still want. Like, it does a really great job doing a description of what asset management is and how some DOTs are looking at using technology and processes to become more efficient. So check it out. So we talked, or I kind of started to get to this, these critical TAM elements. I mentioned process, which is a big thing, people, and technology. And these are the three core components that ODOT focuses on in sustaining our transportation system. And I think that for this conversation of best management practices in GIS, Alan and I will talk a lot about process type things that are very successful in setting up the right things for the people and eventually the technology. Because you can have a wonderful piece of technology, but if you don't have the right process to manage it, to understand what's happening with that information, that technology is not going to ultimately deliver the best return on investment that you're looking for. So why does GIS matter for TAM? Effectively, as DOTs, we own a lot of infrastructure. We own a lot of pavement. We own a lot of bridges and culverts and signs, pavement markings, BMPs, all these different things. And they all exist somewhere. And knowing where that stuff is, when we start to try to make these data-driven decisions, having that database and having that backing so that we can do analysis is important. And where GIS comes in is that concept of linear referencing systems, where I like this statement here where effectively linear referencing allows us to have IT system isolation and integration simultaneously, which creates a level of efficiency that we didn't have. So by that I mean, we can have a separate system for collecting culvert inventories and a separate system for collecting pavement data. But then we can use the LRS to integrate across those systems so that we can do that higher level complex analysis. And that is exactly why GIS is becoming more and more relevant across all DOT operations. To create that integration, you need to have these LRS and GIS components to do it, or at least at this time, it appears to be the best mechanism for achieving that. Some other challenges that I see beyond those high-level industry challenges, when we start thinking about I'm a GIS manager, I'm trying to do stuff in my organization, I'm trying to make progress, I think thinking about these factors that come up is a thing to try to get a handle on. We got changing priorities. We have our own budgetary funding issues. Do I have enough resources and money to buy systems or to do things or get data that we need to solve these problems? I have staffing changes. We have a technology pace that's just rapidly going. We know new versions coming out all the time of different systems. Our requirements and our regulations are changing, and then we have all these other different things. And as a manager, that can become overwhelming, just taking care of all of these different factors, let alone the operational day-to-day factors that we're trying to get done. So when I think about those challenges, I think about this type of a graphic a lot. What are those things that I have control over? What are those things that I influence? And what are those things that I should just have concern over? And I think when what can trip up some managers is they while they have best intentions to try to be involved with things that they have concern or influence over, perhaps they place too much priority on those things and then they lose sight of the stuff that's really within their control and they can have the most impact with. And so some of the best management practices we're going to talk about really focus in on how do I create that control? How do I create that structure to be really effective in those things that I do have control and influence over? And so when we look at that, I think there's two different buckets. There's this management bucket and a leadership bucket that you need to approach these challenges with. Management is more of a pragmatic type of thing. I'm supposed to build X number of widgets. Did we build X number of widgets? Or did we collect this much data? Or we needed to collect this much data? Did we collect that much data? Those type of things. Whereas leadership is looking at more of the, I see the stuff coming down the pipe that we're going to have to tackle in the future. How can we innovate around that? How can we be creative? How can we be adaptable to those types of things? But then there's these common traits that span both leadership and management that are good. If we can embody those as managers in the DOTs and leaders in the DOTs, I think we're going to be more effective. And it really comes down to how well can you communicate across a lot of different groups of people? How accountable can you be to yourself and to your customers? Can you delegate appropriately? And can you empower your staff or your customers more appropriately? And how do you apply all these different traits to what you control, influence, and what you might have concern over? So when I look at those traits, how am I translating that into some type of organized, consolidated plan? And this graphic is how I try to conceptualize a lot of my work. I need to have a vision and mission. I need to understand that. I need to clearly define those things. And I start breaking it down more granular into goals, objectives, critical success factors, KPIs or key performance indicators that eventually have very clear and definable metrics that I can measure. So if I'm going to do something, how do I know I'm being successful? And that is something that can really help clarify what you have control over and what you have influence over when you do these types of exercises. And so something that we try to do is we organize our work into things called programs, which kind of define those high-level vision and mission of what we're trying to do, that are more of those long-term, ongoing operational things that we're trying to achieve. And then how do we break the needs of those programs into projects, which are these specific set of activities that we achieve, or either daily operational things, or we do improvement opportunities to our processes or technologies or different things. And at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Alan, who's going to talk about the concept of a capability maturity model and how this ties into some of these management practices.
Thanks, Ian.
Yep.
Good afternoon or morning, everyone. We talk a little bit, as Ian mentioned, about capability maturity modeling, and I think the real presence of this here and importance of it is that you look at what, and Ian talked about earlier, the people, processes, and technology associated with TAMP, and it applies as well against your GIS organization as a whole. But we want to look at it, self-assess ourselves to some extent on how we're operating as a business, as well as how others see us as a business. And we can do this through capability maturity modeling, where we're really looking at what do we have in terms of enabling technology to support our constituent or stakeholder, and then what do we have, and that would be obviously the technology component, but what do we also have in terms of our execution ability, and that was the processes and people to make sure that we are within our GIS organization, in this case, how we're able to support our customers. And obviously those customers being other departments of the DOT. So if you want to go ahead into the next one, Ian's going to forward for me too, because he's in Ohio and I'm in Orlando, and we don't want to push the presentation back and forth. So the capability maturity model, and there's multiple ones out there, and I know Ian will show one, or at least talk a little bit about one after I go through this piece. But there are multiple tools out there that can help you build a maturity model, and done in different formats. I think there's web-based formats and Excel-based formats to fill out what would be a maturity model. And I'll go over what's inside of these as well, and what that could be made up in the maturity model in a minute. But what it does is it sets out a framework that allows us to lay out a benchmark of how are we doing in certain categories in terms of our capabilities and our data management practices, and how are we performing today, and then we can manage that over time to see if we improve in any of those categories. So the maturity model sets out different levels of where we assess ourselves today, and then we want to monitor and potentially improve on, if we can, in certain areas as we go through time to get up to what would be considered an optimized state. So if you want to go to the next one, Ian. So there's really 5 levels. I've seen a few maturity models that modify this a little bit and may have 4 levels or 6 levels. And it's more about what is inside those levels of how you're doing with your business and where you're at in terms of processes. So we'll step through each of these and each of the different levels, and I'll show you, if you're assessing yourself, what does it mean if I'm at an initial level versus a repeatable versus a defined. So let's go ahead to the next one. And then, so in an initial level, this is really where you don't have any, you're doing business, you're supporting, you support your customer, you make a GIS map for them or something like that in the GIS department, but the process to do it is disorganized. It's individual effort. It's not as a team supporting that particular effort, and it's not a repeatable process. We just did it one time. Next time we're going to do it a different way. The next time we're going to create our legend a different way than the following time. All that kind of stuff. That's your initial capability. You do work, but you don't have any repeatable way to manage that work. So if we go to the next one, where it becomes more of a repeat, and that's more of a reactive process, by the way. So if you move to a repeatable level, in this case, you really have an established process. This established process, when we're going about a particular service that we're providing to our stakeholders, we can do it, and we know how to do it, and it's laid out as a template that we can do over and over. So it's repeatable, but it's not defined. So if we go to the next level and we get to the defined, in this case, now we've documented that process, and it's consistent every time that we do it. So it's repeatable in the same fashion, and it's documented, and it's also a consistent approach to doing it. So that's your middle tier is you've defined that business process. And then the next one, we become even better at it. We're becoming managed now. So we're actually putting those KPIs against what we're doing in a particular situation. In this case, we consider ourselves as a managed performance level and maturity. You have documented processes. We're continuing to update those processes, and potentially if we continue to do that and do it well, we move to more of an optimized position where we're doing continuous process improvement. That's the next one, Ian, that we're actually getting in there, and those documents are getting better and better and we're getting more efficient with our processes, and we're managing that performance, and we can see the improvement. And that's where you're trying to get to an optimized state. So in general, what you're looking at in a capability maturity model is you're trying to get to optimized. The real return on investment analysis that needs to be done, yeah, thanks, as we move through this maturity chain is as we're looking at the different functions of our GIS organization and business is how much does it cost to get to an optimized situation? So if we wanted to improve in one area then versus another, maybe that's too costly. So a 4 is good for us, a managed approach to a defined approach. So it's not one size fits all. Not everybody needs to be optimized in every single business process that they have. It may be too costly to do so. So you want to be able to weigh those as you go over and improve, and you're trying to improve yourself over time or in your department over time. You want to look at each of those individually and see what makes the most sense in terms of the fit. But the model is awesome because it just gives you a way to look at, here's where we assess ourselves. Potentially, if our survey is set up in such a way, others can be assessing us as well, and we can look at where we need to mature our processes. So if you want to go to the next one, Ian. So in terms of Ohio DOT, they did this, they put a maturity model in place and tailored it to the types of questions that were important to the different ODOT GIS department and the businesses that they were supporting. And then they put together an online survey. So this online survey allowed them to go through and define the subject matter experts in each of those divisions that are using GIS data and have needs for GIS data, and said, how is the GIS department supporting me today? The GIS department itself as well, self-assessing itself to see where they feel that they fit in the maturity model in different categories, and I'll show you those categories here in just a second. And I think that is a good way to see, are we even on the same page, or are we, how we feel about ourselves, is it being validated by other departments and how they look at what we're doing. And I don't know, Ian, when you looked at those results, if you want to just mention what that looked like for you.
When we looked at those results, or like right here? Or?
No, I was going to say like the GIS department versus the other departments, and then their feedback and how that were they the same or close or very different?
Well, when we did this, we really looked at like, so we have these different areas now, and didn't get into these. We'll get into these in a minute. But we approached a lot of different data business owners from across the agency. So we weren't just looking solely at like our data out of my shop.
Sure.
We were looking at the hydraulic data. We were looking at the bridge data. We were trying to understand how, as an agency, how successful were we being with our data and information. And we absolutely saw cases where somebody who, like a data business owner who's responsible for a certain data set, they would say, oh yeah, our stuff's great. And then we'd ask some of their customers and they'd say, well, actually, we see some areas for improvement. And so there was a definite gap between that owner and that customer perspective. And so that was very, very telling in where we could, that perception and where we could improve.
Yeah, that's great. And I think it's just a good way to make sure that and as you go over time, like you're looking at this, you want to come back and revisit, because now you see that, okay, the perception versus what is actually happening in the utilization of our data is seen 2 different ways. We need to bring that closer together. So if the different categories that were, and this was definitely debated for some time, and I think with good reason, because these things overlap and there's, one fits into another and all that kind of thing. And it's also trying to make it manageable, because you could have this broken down in terms of their data governance areas. Here you're looking at about, I think it's 10 to 15 areas. You could have had 30 areas potentially, and it just becomes hard to manage and hard to measure your performance over time if you have that many. So in this case, you can see the types of areas that in terms of data governance that came up. Data quality is obviously an important one. Policy, so how are we, do we have the ability to push through the fact that we have data stewards and folks that are, from a policy perspective, that have to provide information across business units and things like that. Organizational capacity, data accessibility. So you can just see the different areas there. And then the ratings that came out, you can see with the ones that are highlighted in orange, where you felt like they were performing at this C and D level, and they definitely could see a large gap for improvement for what they have as target level of maturity. You can see here the target levels are in the 4 to 5 range, but none of them are necessarily at 5 specifically to get all the way to optimize. It's just maybe too costly to do that. So anyway, I think this was a great way to see where do we, and if you go to the next slide, so this shows you where they perform. I'll go back for just a second, as we mentioned.
Yeah.
Another cool thing about these is that you can do these spider diagrams, and it can kind of show you on there. You could overlay this if we broke it down by those different data business owners that Ian talked about and how each one of those performs, so we could see in a particular diagram how we're looking across the agency. Okay, and sorry, next one. So now this actually breaks it down so we can look at the data maturity gaps that we have in data governance, and we can look at, okay, where do we want to focus our efforts? Before doing a maturity model, we may have not have known, hey, we were so far off in system integration from a gap perspective of where we want to be. We need to spend some more time around that. And so this kind of gives you that prioritization of where to focus time, effort, funding to move and try to get better in supporting the customers and supporting the rest of the department. Okay, I think this one's over to you, I believe.
Okay, yeah. So one of the outcomes of the data governance maturity assessment here at ODOT was some recommendations for how do we begin to close those gaps. And we kind of broke this down into these 3 different phases where we need to do this plan and design phase where we say, well, what's going to be our data governance framework? What is that going to look like? We identified, there's probably going to be a need for a new role here of some kind, a chief data officer position. And then we need to create some governance frameworks and committees in different ways and get some executive policies, because it's going to be transformative to our work as an agency. And we'll talk about that more later too. And then we actually need to build that framework, and we need to implement that. And when we get down to the specifics of it, we're actually not going to do any technology changes until phase 3, because we do perceive a need to actually do some technology infrastructure changes, how we manage some technology. But that's when we think about that people, processes, technology piece, we need the processes and people before we touch the technology. And that's the way that we're approaching it. Another capability maturity model that this audience might be interested in is one that's called the Slim Jim T. And this was a maturity model that was created out of a combined effort from a number of DOT representatives. I don't want to list them because I'm probably going to forget some, and I don't want to do that. But there was a number of DOTs that participated in this peer, it was a Federal Highway Peer Exchange series over a couple of years. And the result was this maturity model that was pretty well tailored to the DOTs. And one of the goals of this process was, we found in talking to peers at conferences and on the phone, we had a hard time doing an apples-to-apples comparison of our organizations. I think a lot of that was potentially semantics of one group calling the GIS services team something different in another group or another agency. And so I think this model does a really good job of enabling that apples-to-apples comparison. We made it specific enough that it calls out some specific nuances for DOTs, but we also kept it generic enough that I don't think any organization was going to be particularly tied down or left out about the areas that were being measured. And we broke them into these 5 different maturity areas, organizational structure, leadership, culture, the organizational capability, enterprise GIS sustainability, and those foundational technologies. So it's hosted online at this link by this gentleman named Paul. He's a great guy. It's a Creative Commons public use. Please check it out. And it's a good tool for doing some self-assessments. So moving on into the next area of our process discussion here. So capability maturity models are a great tool for trying to figure out where you are and where you might want to go. And some of the practices that I put in place and started to utilize here at ODOT is business planning. When I moved into my position and started working here at ODOT, I really started to see the GIS team that I was in and started to lead as our own internal consulting group to the rest of the agency and to even external customers that we work with. And even though we're a government agency, I think taking that customer service, business-minded approach has been very fruitful in how we operate. It changes the way we think about things. It changes the way I look at where I invest my time and my resources, and it really helps me understand what type of value I'm actually supposed to get out of any type of activity we're doing. So creating some type of a business plan to focus that message and that objective is a very important thing in my mind. And you can do it through GIS strategic planning, you can do it through business plans, and it kind of organizes all those thoughts of what you're doing, how you're going to work through things, and what are the resources that you need, and how are you going to achieve that. So when we look at that earlier graphic I had before about establishing the vision all the way down to the measurements, we're going to kind of walk through how I'm applying that here at ODOT. So I create this business plan for my section every year. I initially tried to do a 3-year business plan, but I found that was a little bit aggressive for where we were in our maturity of some of our programs. And so I've scaled it back to a year time frame so that we can be very focused and strategic about what we need to get so we can get a long-term sustainable plan that would give us a 3-year rolling plan of what we need to be doing. And it's about a 12-page document that kind of specifies, where are we at right now? What are our guiding principles that we really embrace that we're going to try to apply to all our processes? We talk about capability and maturity there. I also talk a lot about ITIL, which is the Information Technology Service Management practices. It's a industry best practice. It's something that our IT group utilizes. I had many of my team members go out and become certified in this, and it helps us collaborate more effectively with our IT group as well. And I think it does I think ITIL does a great job laying out a lot of operational types of things that you might want to consider when you're trying to organize GIS services, technology, and processes. And then of course in the business plan we talk about our programs, and these are just some examples that the programs that our road inventory team manages, HPMS, Arnold, functional class, all come from different federal mandates, and then the ones in green are more Ohio-based ones. But we give those descriptions, we give those high-level visions and missions for those programs, and then in the work plan or the business plan, we call out every year what are those key goals and objectives that we want to focus on this year? And we can see, I just, at a high level, break down those things. What are we going to do? And I even called out, in this case, this is the 2019 plan we're in right now. We have some things I called out in red that after reviewing last year's progress, we really need to focus on these things, or we're going to start falling behind, or we're not going to achieve our core business objectives. So clarifying this in this fashion provides me as a manager focus, but it also, I get the feedback and collaboration from my team members as we build this. And so it makes sure that we're all on the same page as a team and we're working towards that same end objective. One thing that you can do here in addition to capability maturity is a SWOT analysis. And I'm sure a lot of people have heard about SWOT analysis, and they're really great tools. I actually did one in 2018 when I moved into the role I currently am to get a better understanding of where my section was. And I found this was a high-level thing. It wasn't anything that took a long time to do. It was a way of organizing my thoughts. It was a way of organizing where I think we had strengths and opportunities, and where I think we needed to invest things and time in. And I reviewed this with my team leads and my team members, and they felt it was pretty spot on. And so again, this gives SWOT analysis can give you just additional direction in addition to stuff like capability maturity of how you might want to tackle different challenges. So moving down that whole chart of turning a vision into measurable and actionable items, this is an example of a business plan that I've created for our asset management implementation. So we have a formalized document that's about a 40-page document that says these are our asset management goals and objectives for the agency. And then we started implementing that formally a couple years ago. In the course of that implementation, the different people involved, we noticed that we needed to monitor how well we were doing with the implementation itself. And because we were pushing out technology, we're doing data collection, we're doing all these different things that were big changes for the organization. And so what I did is I took our work plan for that group, and I created these critical success factors and key performance indicators that help us understand how far along we are in like a completeness, that would be that measure from 0 to 100, and our maturity. And just FYI, as far as these numbers are concerned, this was just my draft I did back in January. I have no idea if we're actually that far along, or maybe we're more far along in some things. This is just for illustrative purposes. And so we break these down even further. So the critical success factor is that high-level thing, and then these key performance indicators are those critical things that we have to do to be successful for that critical success factor. And then those third level down are those specific metrics that we can call out and identify, and we can apply SMART measures to. So that's that specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bound. The other thing that we're doing is we're applying KPI balance. And so this is the idea where when you define like a SMART goal, you could sometimes orient those SMART goals in one way more so than another, and that might become imbalance. So for instance, like this inside versus outside, some things are going to be more inside facing towards like your IT group or your internal group that's managing or delivering a service or technology, versus the outside perspective of what is your customer experiencing. And same thing with like leading and trailing. Like a trailing a KPI is going to tell us we anticipated that we were going to complete 10 of these things this last quarter, and we achieved 10 of these things this last quarter. A leading KPI would tell us we anticipate that we can do 10 of these things in the future. And then you start becoming more proactive as a part of reactive. And I think a balance of both of those is a good thing to have, along with these the technology process services, along with these other progress, compliance, effectiveness. So this is a type of a measurement thing that I'm starting to apply to all the core programs in my area. I'm starting to apply it to our data collection system, to our roadway information system, to our asset management, and I think we're probably going to do a similar thing to the data governance program as well. So once we define those, that high-level plan, and then we define those goals and objectives, and then we define how we're going to measure the performance of those goals and objectives, that's where we get to actually taking action to how are we going to improve, how are we going to do the work, how are we going to do all those different things. And that's where project management comes in. There's a number of project management best practices out there, but these are 5 really good critical areas that you want to focus on as far as managing control and risk, resource planning, do you have enough funds, and financial management, operational improvement opportunities for efficiencies, and compliance and control of, that's kind of like scope creep. Do we have the right scope? Do we not have the right scope? Some things that we're doing at ODOT for project management, when I was looking at the road inventory team, when I noticed some challenges. That group has a lot of stuff going on. They have our regular season edits that we have to do for our ongoing operations, but they had a number of projects in flight that were trying to improve our performance. And what I found was our project managers were creating a lot of project plans in isolation. And we were seeing scenarios where Bob's service or Bob's time, Bob being a person on our road inventory team, we needed 80 hours of his time in October for project A and 60 hours of his time for project B in October and another 40 hours of his time for project C. Well, when you have 10 or so different projects going on, you quickly experience a bottleneck of resources when that occurs. And so what I challenged my project management staff to do in this case was to create an MS project file of all the key milestones for all roadway information activities. And by doing that, we were able to quickly realize where we had strategic bottlenecks or resource issues, and we could better focus our activities so we weren't stretching ourselves too thin. And so far, it's been a pretty big success in better coordinating our activities and understanding what we're doing. At a day-to-day level, we started to apply agile practices. And agile is often used for software development, and it's effectively where you break things down into 2-week sprints, and with the goal of achieving whatever you said you were going to achieve within those 2 weeks. We're using an online tool called Asana. There's a lot of different things out there that are similar. This one just works for us. And on the left-hand side, you can see we have these different teams like Collector, TIMS, and SWAT, and so on. They break down these sprints every 2 weeks. And the challenge is that the individuals span multiple teams lots of times. And so as each team is doing their sprint planning, that individual is cognizant of their other responsibilities and other projects, and they can say, hey, I might not be able to do this many tasks because I have another priority in another project. And if for some reason there's a hard constraint between two projects, then those project managers can go to somebody like me as a sponsor and say, we need a judgment call from you to move a priority or to move a timeline or schedule and take that responsibility off of the people doing the work. And so far, I think we've seen a lot of success in this type of organization. Still some things to work out, but it's improved us a lot. And from there, we move into change management, because change management is a huge component of this. We're talking about changing the way we operate, changing how we do things. And if you've never heard of organizational change management, it's a way of approaching how you go about implementing projects, how you recognize what these changes are, and how you mitigate those changes. So I think, Alan, you're going to talk a little bit more about this.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. I think the importance here is walking through best management practices associated with GIS, and Ian's walking through programs and projects that are getting managed. A lot of times the change component is there's oversight associated with it. People don't think about what does this mean to the employees, our staff, and what's going to happen in terms if we put a new process in place, if we put a new tool in place. So I think the idea, and ODOT's doing this as part of their data governance program and in other places and large projects, organizational change management needs to happen early and often. And what that means is bringing people into the project and understanding of the project and have it communicated throughout what the new process, the new tool, or the new data governance strategy, what it means to them. So it's happening throughout the projects or the programs. So that's typically, I've seen it, like I said, this has been a last thought is the change management component, but I've been encouraged recently because there's a couple of different agencies I went to actually have change management staff on site to do exactly this, to manage programs and projects in the change management component within them. So if staff's starting to be involved, I think that's a great movement in the industry to see that it is an important, I mean, obviously, most of the tooling and the stuff out there that is available works. Where the projects fail is in the people component 9 times out of 10, and that failure is because of they haven't communicated what the change may be. So if you go to the next one, Ian, it's kind of just more lays out the definition of change management, how it's the common terms that you hear in terms of change management. It's really about communicating the change, and I think that typically you'll just hear about it different ways, and the word organizational sometimes is not put in front of it, because there's different, I mean, depending on what it is. There's a change management associated with specific project, or it actually affects the whole organization. So I think that's just more of a definition component with this. So you can see system-wide in this case across those domains. Yeah, go ahead. The next one's good. Okay. This one actually breaks it down, so you can see those different. You know, if you're looking at an organizational level change management, these are the different elements associated with it. So it's a full team. It's the education of that team. Management support, as we know, and champions and having a change agent in place is a very big deal. And then we have to look at that change and how it affects structure, roles, how it may even affect our strategic plan or our policies based on what we're doing inside the program. So that change management piece as part of that overall plan, like Ian was showing you earlier, is a good component to have in there so that we know that it's getting covered and dealt with every single time that we look at a new process or project that may happen. Okay. And
the thing is that if you have a good defined process, like the capability maturity model mentions, and you can lay it out in a defined plan, when you experience these changes in structure, roles, strategic planning, and policies, you can easily go and figure out where that change needs to occur and who that impact is. Yeah.
Agreed. Yeah, so these changes too can be not necessarily all internal or planned change. They may be unplanned, and it may be forced through a mandate, a new regulation that comes in. It may be totally external to the agency. So we need to understand what the triggers are and then be prepared to deal with that external source of change that may happen as well. I think it's just important to understand that these are coming from different places, and they may be unpredictable when they happen. So just having a change management approach or an organizational change management approach in place already, you can apply it in these different cases. The next one. So when dealing with, I like this chart a lot, because when you think about it, when dealing with change and staff, and say, for example, we're going to roll out, and I know Ian did this a year ago or 2 years ago, we're going to roll out a new way to collect data in the field. And then we're going to have a new mobile tool. You guys are going to use it, and you're not going to be using paper anymore. This is how you're going to do it. Well, for some people, they embrace that, and they're like, oh yeah, I love new technology, I want to do it. Others, there may be a different emotional reaction. So just understand that people have to process things different ways. And so some may become, as you can see on this scale, immobilized by the fact that we're changing and how we're going about and collecting data in this example. Then there becomes denial and frustration, and then eventually there'll be acceptance. And I've seen that if you could team up the folks that are the early adopters of the process or the change or whatever the technology change may be, with the folks that are not, that seems to bring in that acceptance quite a bit earlier on this time scale. So this is something to think about, is there is a psychological reaction to changes, and this is what that looks like for some folks, and be aware of it and be able to plan for it and deal with it. Okay, next one. And so that, again, I think the big takeaway from this is plan for organizational change early in the process, and make sure that you have a process to work through it at the beginning, and have a communication strategy associated with it before you get deep into a project. And then you're at the end of it, you're saying, okay, here's what we're going to do now, and you're already through the project and no one was aware of it, and then you kind of blindside them, and the emotional reaction hits on that, dismiss it or be immobilized by it. So I think all these principles we talked about, if you want to go ahead to the next one, Ian, really hits on some things that are happening in our industry today. And it makes us think about data governance, and it thinks about data as an asset. We need to apply these best management practices and put them in place, because this is what's happening out there. The data in these big areas of challenges that we have, data storage and data. You think data storage is not a big deal, but we're getting more sensor data than we ever had before. So it is not necessarily the storage component is a big deal, but the ability to deal with LiDAR data and sensor data that's coming from autonomous vehicles and from drones and all these different things. Now we want to do analytics on that. It becomes a big data architecture issue as well. So think about all these different components. And it's nice that we're getting all this kind of information in, but how do we deal with it? This is a huge management challenge. It's a staffing challenge. It's a people process technology challenge that we have. So if you go to the next slide, you got to think about it when we think about data management strategies, is breaking it down into these categories. Data quality is a huge issue, but if you look at it, it's just one piece of the overall puzzle of dealing with what we have to manage, what we have to deal with in terms of data governance. And I think what I like about this graphic is that I'm pulling all these things together. I've got a data management function. I have a communication strategy I need to put against everything that we're going to do in terms of data governance and data quality. And you can see from ODOT's perspective, this data governance is covering 15 different categories of things that are happening within the agency. So the management strategy it's a very big deal for them to be successful in their day-to-day practices that they put this in place. So I think that's why I wanted to bring through those couple of slides.
Okay. So yeah, just to kind of bring it home, we did talk earlier about the capability maturity model that ODOT did on data governance, and we talked about this change management, and we really do see our data governance implementation as being a fairly significant organizational change. It's going to change the way lots of people do their jobs. In some ways large, in some ways small, but it's going to be a change. And we need to do this because of the potential benefit that we're going to get out of it. Right now we're trying to define exactly what data governance is. I think we have an idea, we have those 15 different categories or so that we were looking at, but we don't really have an understanding of what it means to actually apply it. And that's what we're trying to define a framework for that right now. And the why is because, from an asset management perspective and just a general internal operational efficiency perspective, as Alan said, information is the asset. Not only do we invest millions of dollars in collecting data, that becomes valuable just in of itself, but to do the type of analytics to understand how to improve asset management, you need to have some consistency and standards to do that. But then with also some of these new upcoming challenges with automated connected vehicles, new uses of the transportation infrastructure, the only way to effectively manage that is through a really strong data governance program to make sure all these different systems can communicate to one another and can work and integrate. And so that's a big component of that. So we're looking at creating this mission and vision. We're still kind of fleshing these out of what data governance is going to look at. I know it's going to have some type of component with people, processes, and technology, and it's going to have to do a lot with this coordination, standardization, and integration across everything at ODOT so that we can realize the best efficiency possible. And these are just some examples of some things that we have done in the past. We've done some things to implement some best practices and some different standards. And in the future, we want to implement a framework that hopefully avoids some of these things like data redundancy and data unavailability and inaccurate data. Those are some of those real specific things that if we can solve those through our data governance framework, that's going to make us more effective and more efficient. So if you want to, I know Esri is going to be posting these slides later. We have, we just put a couple pages of links in here of a lot of good resources that are available based off of some of the topics that we brought up in the presentation today. And then I think we're ready to open it up for some questions.
Yeah, indeed. Thanks, Alan and Ian. That was great. I think this type of presentation back in the early day of GIS and the state DOTs. The GIS group was really a silo in and of itself. It, was responsible for making some maps for various different areas, but I think as data and information have really become the most critical asset within our DOTs, GIS has had to really transform and become a fundamental part of that IT and data management architecture and structure. And so, Ian, you're at ODOT. You're in the IT group. Is that correct?
No, I'm in the division of planning.
Okay. So can you talk about a little bit just about kind of that relationship to IT and the coordination and the required coordination between the two?
Yeah, so I'm in the division of planning in an office called the Office of Technical Services, and we've established a great relationship with our Do-It partners. And it's weird, or not weird, it's just, my group, my GIS services team, we're building a lot of technology and actually pushing that out to customers. But we've built a way to communicate and collaborate with our DOT groups, our database group, our server teams, and we work with the PMO staff. We actually have a lot of PMO that are embedded directly in our area to help facilitate that, to make sure that we're adhering to the policies for software development life cycles and different things. And it's a great partnership because our Do-It area, when we started doing a lot of this stuff, they didn't have the GIS expertise that some of the people in planning and technical services had. So it was a really good win-win for the agency. And I meet every 2 weeks with the IT managers, our office does, to talk about problems. And then our IT group has recently started this 90-day plan where we, not only us, but other areas of the agency get together and say, these are the things that are happening in the next 90 days. And to make sure that everybody who might be involved with those initiatives from a technology perspective are aware. It's a full day off-site meeting that occurs every 90 days, and it's been huge for our collaboration.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'd like to add to that just real quick, Terry, is that
Yep.
Even as part of their data governance, and this is maybe some things that other folks may take away from it, as part of their data governance process, the ODOT business owners working with IT to the level of putting it into Do-It strategic plan, and they're allowing that to happen. And I think it's important because now that strategic plan will move forward with all of those different requirements in it. So I think that's a big deal.
Okay. There is a question that came in relating to really sort of the budget pressures, and has that really impacted your ability to implement some of the changes that you identified in the presentation?
It depends. I suppose it depends on which ones you're talking about. A lot of the stuff that my team does from a technology perspective, I fund out of federal SBR dollars. So from a agency budget crunch of doing transportation infrastructure, those SBR dollars cannot be used for filling potholes. So we're fortunate in that sense. I do think that some of the budget stuff that we're experiencing does have impact somewhat on some of the stuff that we do. It does impact our resourcing level in some cases, staffing levels, and different things. So it depends on the situation and depends on what you're talking about.
Okay. And another question relating to how long do you think it will take you to go from really a strategy of data governance to a data quality management? In other words, really being able to fully implement the strategy that you identified.
That's a great question. I think there's a lot of assumptions. I think the biggest assumption that I have right now is it comes down to our staffing. I think for us to do this, we're going to need executive buy-in to put some FTE personnel behind our data governance initiative. If we are unsuccessful in achieving that, our timeline for implementing data governance is going to drag out, or just not drag out, it's just going to expand, because you need people to focus on this stuff. I have a hard time. I know our current project is a 2-year project to set up a framework, get that framework implemented, and hand that off to this group of individuals who are going to operate the data governance framework. And then there's a component of that project to do a more detailed assessment of what technology improvements need to occur. And that could include creating a true enterprise warehouse or data lake of some sort. It could include some business intelligence. It could include modifying existing systems for standardization purposes. It could include setting up data quality management plans as well. So we were hoping to have most of that implemented within 5 years, or at least started. We'll have to see, because again, it takes a certain level of resource commitment for that to happen, and we haven't gotten there in the process yet.
Okay. And a question from an old friend of mine, Alan Rao at the Volpe Center. He's asking if you've gone through an IVV independent validation and verification review, or CMM level 3 appraisal. So have you had kind of an outside somebody taking a look and really validating what you're doing?
I guess it would depend on validating from what perspective, I guess. I'm not sure. I know like Federal Highway has done they do a regular review of a safety data assessment, and we recently went through that. But I'm not familiar with what this specific assessment is, so I'm not sure if I can speak to that.
Okay. All right. So anyway, we're going to have to, that's about all the time that we have today. We will, as we've mentioned, we will make these slides available. In addition, this webinar will be posted to the website. So it will allow you to come back, re-review many of the key sections. I really think this was a really, really valuable presentation. So again, thanks, Alan. Thanks, Ian. Great work that you've done at ODOT. And I hope others have been able to learn from this webinar. So thank you all for joining us, and we'll look forward to you in the future webinars. Okay, thank you.